management. Taking control of autonomic reflexes. What's an autonomic reflex? It's an automatic knee-jerk reaction. What I'm going to do today is to take you through, the first part of the session is to explain some of the mechanisms as simply as possible. I'm taking a very, very complex subject here and I'm presenting it as simply as I can in order for you to get the best possible advantage from it. And after a cup of coffee in the second part this afternoon, we'll take these principles and put them into practice. Okay? What I'm going to teach you to do is to take control of those autonomic reflexes that normally operate automatically without your conscious intervention. So let's start by having a look at the stress models that are put forward by scientists. First of all, we have a medical definition. According to Mosby's Medical Dictionary, stress is any emotional, physical, social, economic or other factor that requires a response to change. For example, dehydration, which can cause an increase in body temperature, or separation from parents, which can cause a child to cry. So the medical definition is a factor that requires a response to change. Change is a key word here. Hooke's law of elasticity. This is where the use of the word stress actually comes from. According to the engineering model, external stresses give rise to a stress reaction or strain in metal, or in this case we're talking about individuals. So the stress is located in the source or the stimulus in a surrounding environment. Therefore, stress is what happens to a person and not what happens within a person, according to this law of elasticity. Physiological model. The physiological model is primarily concerned with what happens within the person. That is the response aspect of the model. In particular, the physiological and to a lesser extent the psychological changes which occur as a result from stressors, from the external stress. One of the earliest authorities on the physiological dimensions of stress was Cannon, who identified the bodily changes in response to pain, hunger, fear and rage. These are primitive responses. And we go back to that, we come back to these primitive urges. Later on, 1956, psychologist Hans Selye suggested that stress is the body's non-specific response to the external demands placed upon it. Selye's original observation was made when he was a medical student himself. He noted the general malaise or syndrome associated with being ill regardless of the nature of the illness. The syndrome was characterised by several symptoms including loss of appetite, loss of weight, loss of strength, loss of ambition, and a typical facial expression associated with sickness. Further examination of extreme cases revealed major physiological changes including enlargement of the adrenal cortex, shrinkage of the thymus, spleen and lymphatics. All of these organs involved in the body's immune system. And eventually deep bleeding ulcers of the stomach and upper gut. Seligman called his discovery of non-specific responses the general adaptation syndrome, or GAS. Then we come to the transactional model. Transactional model is a blend of the engineering model and the physiological model, bringing them together. This model sees stress as an interaction between people and their environment. In particular, when there's an imbalance between the person's perception, key perception, between the person's perception of the demands being made of them by the situation and their ability to meet those demands. And then when failure to cope is important. Because it's the person's perception of this mismatch between demand and ability which causes stress, the model allows for important individual differences in what are perceived to be sources of stress and how much stress is experienced. So our perception has an awful lot to play in this. People may also differ in terms of characteristic physiological responses to stress. For example, some will typically have migraine headaches, others break out in a rash, others have stomach pains, and so on. Individual differences. And then, of course, there are also wide differences in how people cope with stress mentally, emotionally, and in their behaviour. Now we move on to the neurophysiological model. This is one of my favourites. And I'll read you a quote. The neurophysiological model. Stress is the emotional and neurophysiological confusion that is created when the mind tries to override the automatic impulse to knock the living daylights out of someone who desperately deserves it. But many a true word is spoken in jest. There's a sequential link, beginning with a thought, usually quite often unconscious, which creates an emotion, be it fear, anxiety, frustration, anger. Those are negative emotions, but a thought can also create positive emotions. But let's focus on the negative ones and their relationship to stress. So the thought leads to a feeling, an emotion, which then leads to an instinctive reaction, the physiological response, the behaviour. So we have a sequence here. We have thought, emotion, action. If the instinctive response is prevented by the intervention of a rational thought, then the confusion is created from the conflict between the rational and the instinctive, which results in stress. So on the one hand, you want to knock the living daylights out of someone. On the other hand, being civilised, being rational, not wanting to break the law or break someone's head, prevents you from doing it, creates tension. My favourite is homeostasis. So what is homeostasis? For those of you who are medics, nurses, practitioners, you will know what this is. For those of you who are not, let me explain very simply, because this is the core of managing stress. Homeostasis, according to Mosby's medical dictionary, is a relative constancy in the internal environment of the body, naturally maintained by adaptive responses that promote healthy survival. Various sensing, feedback and control mechanisms function to effect this steady state. Some of the key control mechanisms are the reticular formation in the brainstem and the endocrine glands. Some of the functions controlled by homeostatic mechanisms are the heartbeat, homeostasis, blood pressure, body temperature, electrolyte balance, respiration, and glandular secretion. These are bodily functions that we don't have to think about. They're all automatic. They're controlled by the autonomic nervous system. And this is the model of stress that I particularly favour. And I'll go on in a moment to explain why. All organisms, including human beings, maintain a balance with their cellular structure that maintains equilibrium through fluctuations and a constant internal environment that is essential to life. To go without water, you die of thirst. When you start to get hungry, your internal mechanisms, your homeostasis, tell you that you're getting thirsty. Your internal mechanisms tell you instinctively, physiologically, that you're getting hungry. We live in a world full of pressures, agents of change, constraints and hidden determinations. And we're all vulnerable to these effects. No one can deny that modern economic fluctuations we're experiencing right now. People are suffering enormous stresses because of the financial situation in the economy right now. And the pressures that have to be endured by businesses are contributing to an increase in stress-related sickness, including heart disease, psychosomatic illness, irritable bowel syndrome, ulcers, psoriasis, acute panic attacks, and many more disorders. This puts an enormous burden on the NHS, on health services. So difficult economic circumstances cause pain and sickness. Stress is created when the individual attempts to cope with changes in the immediate environment. For example, deprivation of water in a hot environment raises the body temperature and we sweat and become thirsty. The resulting stress causes us to take positive steps to counteract the discomfort and the danger of dehydration and death from thirst. Another example of stress is the distressed crying that an infant expresses when it's deprived of close parental contact. At the very least, stress makes us irritable and unproductive. And at worst, it can cause death. It interferes with family relationships and efficiency in the workplace, as well as with an individual's normal healthy well-being. There's an awful lot more I can say about stress and how it interferes with our daily functioning, our efficiency and our relationships. But I'm not going to do that because it is a huge subject. What I'm concerned with here are the instinctive, automatic, and that means without thinking, reactions to stress that are primitive and animalistic. The fight or flight response. Fight, flight, or freeze. I want to emphasise this because it helps me to illustrate how an enormously complex subject that attracts huge funding and interest and input into investigating it. Stress management's become a huge industry. Everybody wants solutions to find out how to deal with it, how to identify it, how to deal with it, and how to manage it. But going right back to this homeostasis and going back to the primitive animalistic mechanism, the fight or flight response, actually holds the key to managing it. What I want to do now is draw your attention to the relationship we've been talking about, change, and how external pressures can impact on us, create problems. Let's just have a quick look at the relationship between the internal and the external. The internal environment that is within you, within the individual. We have the nervous system, the endocrine system that controls our hormones, the immune system helps protect us from infection. These are physiological components of the internal environment. They're all connected. You'll see that in just a minute. But also part of the internal environment are our own beliefs, our own perspective, our own worldview, how we see the world and what we believe about the world and what we believe about ourselves. In addition to that, we have cognitive processing, cognitive psychology, how we think. The external environment, again, going back to the primitive fight or flight response, as an animal in a primitive world, we have natural enemies. We don't live in such a dangerous world today unless you go to war, then you've got enemies, or if you live in a dangerous area. But in a civilized environment that most of us do live in, we have external pressures that come from the demands of our families, work demands, and the demands of our own health. So my question is this. Which of these internal elements can we control? So you may be sitting there asking yourself, okay, which of these elements can I control? I'm going to be taking a closer look at this later on. The external environment. Which of these elements can we control? So right at the core of our ability to manage stress and stay healthy, two principal factors have emerged so far. Our perception, how we look at the world, our core beliefs and worldview, and control. Which of those internal factors can we control, and which of those external factors can we control? Now you can look at your entire life experience and everything that happens to you in the workplace, in your relationships, at school, college, university, wherever you are and whatever you're doing, you stop and think, what can I control and what can I not control? We begin to get an idea of how we manage our lives. Do we try to control things that are outside our control? As individuals, we can't control the national economy. It's very difficult to know how to control the relationships you have in your workplace. I'm not here to discuss that. What I'm here to discuss are these other factors that we would normally assume are outside of our control but are internal to us. The nervous system, the endocrine system, and the immune system. So what I'm going to do, when you look at this chart here, I'm working from the bottom up. We can change the way we think, we can change our worldview, and by doing that we can actually change how this automatic nervous system, endocrine system, and immune system works. So let's first of all take a very simple look at the nervous system. It's split into two parts, the autonomic and the central. The central nervous system is the motor, the sensory motor system. Our five senses: sight, sound, hearing, touch, taste, and our ability to move. These are all controlled by the central nervous system, the brain, the spinal column, right the way through to the periphery nerves. But what really concerns us here is the autonomic nervous system. And you can see from this diagram, I've divided it into two parts: the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. Well, we'll have an understanding of what this division means. An autonomic reaction. As I've said, the fight-or-flight response in homeostasis is concerned with the perception of a threat. The stimulus is the perception of a threat. And that triggers the sympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system releases, through the endocrine system, chemicals into the bloodstream. Cortisol, adrenaline principally, but there are others. And this causes the automatic reflex action to fight or run away. And so the threat is dealt with. They'll run away from it or confront it. This is the autonomic or automatic reaction that is beyond conscious awareness. This is instinctive. You can be walking down a dark alley at night and suddenly you hear footsteps behind you, very close. Straight away, this kicks into play. Immediately, your heart rate goes up. Your blood rushes around your blood. Cortisol and adrenaline rush into your bloodstream and you're there, ready to run away or freeze or fight. Now the cognitive response, there's a difference. You have the external stimulus, the sympathetic nervous system kicks into play, which releases the hormones, adrenaline, cortisol, into the bloodstream. But then you stop. You turn round, and that person who you thought was going to attack you actually turns out to be a close friend or relative. You go, oh, thank God for that, you nearly frightened me to death. The cognitive processing, the realisation, the rationalisation kicks into play, and the reaction turns into a response. And this is the difference between reaction, automatic, response is thought out. So the threat is dealt with in a different way. I should be more accurate and say the perceived threat is dealt with in a different way. Because it depends on whether that external stimulus here, is that a real threat, or is it perceived to be a threat? Is it imagined to be a threat? You can be imagining the worst thing possible that might happen to you as you're walking down the street, or you get out of bed, or you're going to work. And that perceived threat in the future starts your immune system from being interfered with by this release of chemicals into the bloodstream that are preparing you for the threat that you perceive incorrectly. But they're rushing around in your body, and if they're there for any length of time, they become toxic. And this is what causes your ill health. For those of you who are interested at a deeper level of how this works, when we look at the brain, go right back to the primitive brain, the limbic system, and there in the limbic system is the amygdala, which I like to regard as the internal antenna, the early warning system, that sixth sense that's triggered when you perceive a threat. And that starts the whole process. Moving on from the central nervous, rather the autonomic nervous system, into the hormonal pathways. Here we have an illustration that was drawn up. I'm not going to go into this because, again, I just wanted to use this slide to illustrate to you how complex a study of stress can be. So I'm not even going to highlight this, I just wanted to show you this slide very quickly in passing. For those of you who are interested, these are the hormones that are released during the stress response. And those of you who have a medical bent, then these will be of interest to you. But we don't really need to fully understand all this. Those of you who do have an interest, an academic interest, here's something that you may like to look at. Presented by John Milsom, who suggested that stress is good for us to a degree. And he presented a paper, and again I'm not going to go into any great detail. I'm just going to pick out one or two bits for you. Physiological stress response. Since stress is at least manifested through biological pathways, we first isolate this biological stress response from the vast array of its possible precipitating stresses and from its many psychosocial processes and results. I'm not going to go into any detail, but for those of you who are interested, this is a very, very interesting piece of work. And if you have a computer and access to the internet, you will find the full document there. In Systems and Behavioural Research Science, a model of the youth stress system for health illness by John Milsom. But we don't want to give you that. What we want to do, we don't want a full academic understanding of what's at work here. To do that, we can go to university and study it for years. What we want to do, simply and effectively, is take control. We take control by pre-stimulus. By having at our disposal a method of dealing with stress before it happens. The pre-stimulus response involves the parasympathetic nervous system. We saw earlier that the threat triggers the sympathetic nervous system, which triggers the endocrine system, releases all those hormones, and if they're not dispersed adequately, if we're walking about in a state of constant hypertension, causing blood pressure and so on, these chemicals become toxic. This has to be reversed because homeostasis now has got out of balance. So to correct the imbalance, we need to bring into play the parasympathetic nervous system, which counteracts that flood of cortisol and adrenaline through the bloodstream and allows us to take cognitive control rather than automatic, uncontrolled reflexes, which gives us the ability to respond in a more appropriate way to the stimulus. Now there's lots and lots of ways that have been developing in recent years to help us achieve this objective, taking control and preventing ourselves getting sick when we're under pressure. And one of my favourite approaches, I studied this at Bangor, is mindfulness. It's becoming very, very popular and it's being introduced throughout the NHS. So those of you who are interested in following this through, mindfulness is a course of study that is proving to be very, very fruitful. And when we look at mindfulness, we look at the stress reaction model of mindfulness, we can see here a more detailed illustration, an expansion of the simple diagram I gave you a few moments ago. This is the basic stress reaction model. And again, we don't need to go into any great detail because all I've given you in its simplified form is the sympathetic nervous system, the endocrine system, the immune system, and how to intervene and take control cognitively. When we look at this diagram, and move on to the next slide, we see the blank space on the right there, right, on the next slide, is filled up with our cognitive response. And again, the difference between automatic reaction, uncontrolled reaction, and controlled response. So this is what mindfulness is teaching, okay? And this is what we're going to do today. I'm going to introduce now a new term, psychoneuroimmunology. Psycho, the mind, or originally the spirit, from the Greek psyche. Neuro, the brain, immunology, immune system. So what have we got there in that word? Psychoneuroimmunology. Thought, brain, immune system. Or in other words, PNI, or mind over matter, or mind over body. Because the psycho is over the brain. Mind cure. We're treading on dangerous ground now because in the world of medicine, the medical model sees the body as an organism that, like a machine, needs to be repaired. Doesn't yet recognise completely the power of the mind in overcoming illness. So introducing this topic here, as I said, is treading on dangerous ground as far as medicine is concerned. But what I'm going to do this afternoon, with your help, I'm going to teach you how to put this into practice in dealing with stress. Healthy mind equals healthy body. I'm going to demonstrate to you that your mind is the creator of what you experience. Your mind can be used to help you deal with stress. It can help you heal yourself of many things. Again, we're treading on dangerous ground, so I'm going to back up a little bit and not go any further on this. But it also demonstrates that your mind, your negative thoughts, can be destructive. So your beliefs, your worldview is important. And we will demonstrate this afternoon. We demonstrate mind as creator and as healer this afternoon. So let's go back again to this interactive relationship between the internal and the external environment. And we asked the question, didn't we? What can we control? Beliefs and worldview, we can control those because we can change them. We can change the way we look at the world. We can change our perception. If you have the belief that the only cure for sickness is medicine, you can change that belief, use your cognitive faculties, put them into effect, and demonstrate for yourself how to do that. So what next? Coffee break? Followed by some serious mindfulness and psychoneuroimmunology. Thank you.
Do I now turn this off?
Thank you.
How do I do